Picture this. It's the spring of 1972. A small, gray-haired man in a plain suit stands at passport control in Tel Aviv, holding the leash of a Shih Tzu named Brother. He is 70 years old. He has a bad heart, arthritis in both hands, and a stomach that has been chewed up by ulcers for the better part of 2 decades. Behind him is a fight he has just lost, a 2-year legal battle, all the way to the Supreme Court of the State of Israel, for the one thing his money could never buy him, the right to stay. In a few hours, he will board a plane back to the United States. He does not know what is waiting for him when the wheels touch down. Maybe federal agents, maybe a courtroom, maybe, if the wrong people have the wrong information, something much quieter and much more permanent. If you've seen The Godfather Part II, you already think you know how this story ends. You watched the fictionalized version, a frail old Don named Hyman Roth, flying home in disgrace, gunned down in the middle of an airport in front of a wall of television cameras, dying face first on the tile, while reporters shove microphones into the chaos. It's one of the most quietly devastating assassinations in American film. It's also, in the most literal sense, a lie. Because the real man Hyman Roth was built on, the man who inspired his voice, his empire, his illness, his philosophy, even his most famous line of dialogue, didn't die at that airport. He walked off that plane. He went home to Miami Beach. He fought the government in court and won. And then he lived for another 11 years, mowing his lawn, feeding pigeons at a hotel coffee shop, walking his dog on the beach, while the FBI followed him at a discreet distance, waiting for a man who was never going to give them anything more than a gnawed good morning. Hollywood killed him at the airport because Hollywood needed an ending. The real story never gave anyone that satisfaction. And that difference between the myth and the man is the whole story we're about to tell. This is the true history hiding inside The Godfather Part II, not the movie you remember, the one they base it on. Before we go further, drop in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read everyone. And if true crime history is your thing, hit subscribe now, because this channel goes deep, and you don't want to miss what's coming later in this one. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. Not the movie's beginning. The real one. Every myth needs an origin, and this one starts about 4,000 miles from Havana, in a town most Americans have never heard of, in a country that no longer exists under the name it had when he was born there. In 1902, in the city of Grodno, then part of the Russian Empire, today part of Belarus, a Polish-Jewish family welcomed a son they named Meyer Lansky. It was not a gentle place to be born Jewish. Grodno sat inside the Pale of Settlement, the strip of the Russian Empire where Jews were legally confined, and the early 20th century in that region meant one thing above almost everything else: pogroms, organized, often state-tolerated violence against Jewish communities, sweeping through towns like Meyer's with brutal regularity. His father left first, in 1909, crossing to America to find work and a foothold. 2 years later, in 1911, Meyer's mother brought her sons across the ocean to join him, through the port of Odessa, into New York Harbor, and finally down into the tenements of the Lower East Side of Manhattan. If you want to understand almost every figure who later reshaped organized crime in America, Lansky included, you have to start here, in this specific slice of New York City, in this specific decade. The Lower East Side at the turn of the century wasn't just poor. It was a pressure cooker of immigrant desperation, crisscrossed by different ethnic gangs competing for the same 6 square blocks of turf, the same pushcarts, the same protection rackets. Italian boys, Jewish boys, Irish boys. They didn't grow up segregated from each other so much as thrown together, fighting each other for survival and, in the process, learning exactly who among their rivals was worth doing business with instead of war. Meyer Lansky became, in the American way, Meyer Lansky. He started school in Brooklyn. His father pressed garments for a living, hard, low-paying work, and the family lived the way most immigrant families on the Lower East Side lived. Crowded, precarious, one bad month from disaster. And like a lot of boys in that world, Lansky found his real education on the street corner, not in the classroom. It's here that the legend and the actual record start to blur a little, the way they do with almost every founding myth in organized crime. One version has it that Lansky met a teenage bully named Charlie Luciano when Luciano tried to shake him down for money on the way to school, and instead of paying, young Meyer fought back, impressing Luciano so much that instead of an enemy, Lansky made a friend for life. It's a great story. It also may be exactly that. A story cleaned up and retold so many times across so many books and documentaries that no one can say for certain anymore which parts are true and which parts calcified into legend along the way. What both Lansky's own account and separate historical retellings agree on is simpler and less cinematic. He and Luciano crossed paths as teenagers on the Lower East Side, in an environment where street reputation was currency, and something clicked between them. A mutual respect between a Sicilian immigrant kid with a gift for violence and organization, and a Polish Jewish kid with a gift for numbers. Around the same time, on that same stretch of poverty-stricken blocks, Lansky crossed paths with another teenager, a volatile, undeniably charismatic kid named Benjamin Siegel. History would come to know him by a nickname he hated. Bugsy, short for crazy as a bedbug, a description of his temper that stuck to him for the rest of his short, violent life. Where Lansky was careful and calculating, Siegel was combustible, magnetic, impulsive, dangerous in a way that made people either fall in love with him or get out his way. The two boys became close friends almost instantly, and out of that friendship came something that would echo through American crime history for the next 50 years. A partnership. By his mid-teens, Lansky was already running the kind of small-time hustle that read, in retrospect, like a business apprenticeship. Floating craps games, the kind that moved from location to location to dodge police attention, testing his instinct for math, risk, and reading people under pressure. It didn't take him long to notice something important. The kind of money Siegel was pulling in from petty theft and violence dwarfed what Lansky was making running dice games on a street corner. If this was the business, Lansky decided, then this was the business he wanted to be in. Together, Lansky and Siegel built what came to be called the Bugs and Meyer Mob, a name that, appropriately, fused Siegel's nickname with Lansky's given one. It wasn't a large operation by later standards, but it was efficient and it was ruthless. Lansky brought organizational skill and a head for mechanics. He understood cars, understood logistics, while Siegel brought muscle and a genuine talent for intimidation. Together, they built out a gang that specialized in stolen automobiles, hijacking, and eventually, as Prohibition transformed the entire American underworld, bootlegging. It's worth pausing here on some of the movies rarely dramatized with any nuance. What Prohibition actually did to American crime. When the 18th Amendment took effect in 1920, it didn't stop Americans from drinking. It just made drinking illegal, which meant an enormous, previously legal industry, alcohol production, distribution, and sale, was handed over almost overnight to whoever was willing to break the law to supply it. For ambitious young men on the margins of legitimate society, immigrants, the children of immigrants, people locked out of respectable careers by prejudice and poverty, Prohibition wasn't a moral crisis. It was the single greatest business opportunity of their lifetimes. Lansky, Siegel, and Luciano all understood this instinctively, and they threw themselves into it. Bootlegging, smuggling, and the muscle required to protect both made all three of them, along with a growing circle of allies, genuinely, dangerously wealthy in a very short period of time. But what set Lansky apart from almost everyone else in that world, from the earliest days of his career, was that he didn't just want to make money illegally. He wanted to understand where that money went afterward, how to protect it, grow it, and eventually make it disappear into the legitimate economy where no prosecutor could touch it. That single obsession, the laundering of dirty money into clean money, would define the rest of his life, and it's the exact trait that Coppola's screenwriters, decades later, would try to distill into the character of Hyman Roth. Not a man of violence, but a man of ledgers. The Bugs and Meyer Mob is also credited, in several historical accounts, as an early prototype for what would later become one of the most feared enforcement operations in American organized crime history. Murder Incorporated, the group of contract killers later run out of Brooklyn under Louis Lepka Buckleter and Albert Anastasia. Lansky and Siegel's outfit essentially pioneered the model, a dedicated crew of gunmen for hire, available to any gang willing to pay for a hit. That Murder Incorporated would later formalize and industrialize on a much larger scale. Here's the thing about Lucky Luciano that separates him from almost every other crime boss of his generation, And it's the thing that made him worth Meyer Lansky's loyalty. Luciano understood, earlier than almost anyone else in his world, that the old way of doing things was a dead end. The old way, in the 1920s New York underworld, meant something specific. It meant rigid, ethnically exclusive gangs run by aging, old-world bosses, men the younger generation contemptuously nicknamed the Mustache Petes, who organized their operations along strict Sicilian lines, refused to work with non-Italians as equals, and settled disputes the way their fathers had settled disputes in Sicily, with blood feuds that could drag on for years and destroy everyone's profits in the process. Two of the most powerful of these old guard bosses, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, were locked for years in an increasingly bloody power struggle that would come to be called the Castellamarese War, a conflict that, from a purely business perspective, made absolutely no sense. It was expensive, it was dangerous, and it constantly threatened to draw unwanted police and press attention onto operations that depended on staying quiet. Luciano, Lansky, and their allies, a rising generation that included Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and others, looked at this older model and saw something closer to a liability than a tradition worth preserving. Why should Italian gangs and Jewish gangs and Irish gangs spend money and blood fighting each other over overlapping territory, when they could instead divide that territory efficiently, cooperate on shared ventures like bootlegging and gambling, and pool their resources against a common enemy, law enforcement? It was, in essence, an argument for turning organized crime from a collection of warring tribes into something closer to a cartel, or, as the men themselves increasingly began to think of it, a syndicate. The catalyst for this transformation, according to multiple historical accounts, was a man who is often left out of the popular imagination entirely. Overshadowed by flashier names like Capone and Luciano, Johnny the Fox Torrio. Torrio had made his name in Chicago in the early 1920s, building a bootlegging empire alongside, and eventually handing it off to a young protege he'd more or less mentored into power, Alphonse Capone. After a near-fatal shooting in 1925 forced Torrio into a strategic retirement from Chicago, he didn't disappear from organized crime. He simply repositioned himself as something closer to an elder statesman, an operator whose real talent had never been violence but organization. Following the death of the legendary racketeer and fixer Arnold Rothstein in November 1928, a man who had mentored a young Lansky in the gambling business, and whose underworld banking operations gave Lansky an early education in how criminal money actually moved, Torrio saw an opening. He began quietly stitching together the East Coast major bootleggers into a loose cooperative arrangement, a cartel of major rum-running operations stretching from Boston down to Philadelphia. That came to be nicknamed the Big Seven. That was the appetizer. The main course came in the spring of 1929. Ask 10 historians who actually organized a meeting that changed the future of American organized crime, and you might get 4 or 5 different answers. Some credit the idea to Torrio, the elder statesman looking to formalize what he'd started with the Big Seven. Some credit Frank Costello. Some credit the biographer of another gangster entirely, insisting it was really Abner Lungi Zwillman's idea. And some, perhaps the most charmingly plausible version, credit an accident of timing involving Meyer Lansky's own wedding. Here's that version, and it's too good a piece of organized crime folklore not to tell. In early May of 1929, Meyer Lansky got married. Casting around for a honeymoon destination, his closest underworld allies apparently concluded that the seaside resort town of Atlantic City, New Jersey, would be perfect, not just for a honeymoon, but for something bigger. Why not combine business and pleasure? Why not use Lansky's wedding trip as cover to quietly convene the most significant underworld summit that had ever taken place on American soil? Whether that's a literal, precise origin story or simply the version that stuck, because it's irresistible, the outcome is not in dispute. From May 13th to May 16th, 1929, at the Breakers Hotel and the President Hotel in Atlantic City, an extraordinary collection of criminal power gathered in one place. Al Capone came in from Chicago, along with his enforcer Frank Nitti and his numbers man Jake Guzik. From New York and New Jersey came the biggest delegation of all: Torrio, Luciano, Costello, Siegel, Lansky, and the enforcement duo of Louis Buckleter and Jacob Shapiro. The gathering was hosted, in the sense of guaranteeing the meeting could happen without police interference, by Atlantic City's own political boss, Enoch Nucky Johnson, the very same Nucky Johnson who would later become the central character of the HBO series Boardwalk Empire. Deliberately absent from this meeting were the two most powerful old guard bosses in New York, Masuria and Maranzano, along with Maranzano's ambitious young Lieutenant Joseph Bonanno. That exclusion wasn't an oversight. It was the entire point. This was, in effect, a meeting of the future, deliberately convened without the men who represented the past. Over 4 days at the Jersey Shore, this new generation of criminal leadership hammered out something that had never really existed before in American organized crime, an actual framework for a national business, not a truce between rival gangs sharing a single city, and infrastructure, territorial boundaries that reduce the incentive for costly turf wars, shared distribution networks for bootleg liquor moving between regions, and underneath all of it, an emerging philosophy that would define the rest of the 20th century's organized crime landscape: cooperation across ethnic lines. Sicilian mobsters, Neapolitan mobsters, Jewish mobsters, Irish mobsters, all of them, for the first time, treated as potential business partners rather than automatic rivals, bound together not by blood or heritage, but by the much stronger glue of shared profit. It's hard to overstate how radical this was for its time. The Mustache Pete generation had organized crime almost exclusively along ethnic and familial lines, the same way their fathers and grandfathers had organized power in the old country. What Torrio, Luciano, Costello, and Lansky proposed instead was something closer to modern corporate structure, a holding company for crime, with regional franchises that answered loosely to a shared commission, all of them united by the recognition that violence between members was bad for everyone's bottom line. Historians who study the period generally consider the Atlantic City Conference more consequential in terms of shaping the future of American organized crime than the more famous 1946 Havana Conference we're going to spend the rest of this video unpacking. And it's worth sitting with that for a second, because it tells you something important about how this story actually works. The most cinematic moment isn't always the most historically important one. Atlantic City in 1929 didn't have a golden telephone or a rooftop birthday cake or a fictional Michael Corleone standing in the corner listening. It had 4 unglamorous days of men in hotel rooms negotiating territory and cash flow. But it's the meeting that actually built the machine everything else in this story runs on. Atlantic City set the philosophy. What came next set the enforcement. The old guard bosses, Masuria and Maranzano, didn't simply step aside because a younger generation had decided their model was obsolete. The Castellamarese wore ground on into 1930 and 1931, an increasingly costly and increasingly pointless conflict between the two aging dons, each one demanding absolute loyalty from underlings like Luciano, who could see, with total clarity, that the fighting was bleeding away profits that could otherwise be shared. So Luciano did something that would come to define his legacy as much as anything else he ever did. He ended the war from the inside. In April of 1931, Masuria was gunned down at a Coney Island restaurant, a killing multiple historical accounts described as having been arranged, at least in part, through Luciano's coordination, with Lansky's close friend Bugsy Siegel reportedly among the shooters. With Masuria removed, Luciano pledged loyalty to Maranzano, who briefly declared himself the new boss of bosses over the reorganized New York families. The 5-family structure that, in various forms, persists to this day. Maranzano's reign lasted only a few months. He was, by most historical accounts, exactly the kind of rigid, old-world boss the younger generation had spent 2 years scheming to eliminate, and by September 1931 he too was dead, killed, according to the most widely accepted version of events, by men working under Luciano's direction, ending the Castellamarese war for good and clearing the field entirely for the new model of organized crime that Atlantic City had theorized 2 years earlier. What emerged from the wreckage is a structure most people, even casually familiar with mob history, would recognize today: a commission-style national syndicate, cutting across ethnic lines, in which regional bosses ran their own territories but cooperated on shared interests, narcotics distribution, gambling, labor racketeering, through an informal but very real governing body. Some accounts date the formal founding of this body, sometimes called a National Crime Syndicate, to a 1934 gathering. but its intellectual and organizational DNA traces directly back to Atlantic City in 1929, and to the four men most consistently credited as its architects: Johnny Torrio, the elder strategist; Lucky Luciano, the operational leader who cleared the path by force; Frank Costello, the diplomat who would later be nicknamed the Prime Minister of the Underworld; and Meyer Lansky, the financial mind who would spend the rest of his career building out the machinery that let all of this newly consolidated criminal wealth quietly disappear into the legitimate economy. There's a detail about Lansky's position in this new syndicate that's easy to skip past, but it's essential to understanding both the real man and the fictional character he inspired decades later. Meyer Lansky could never be, a formally initiated member of the Italian-American Mafia, La Cosa Nostra. The Sicilian-derived organization Luciano and his allies belonged to restricted full membership to men of Italian, and specifically Sicilian, heritage. Lansky, as a Polish-Jewish immigrant, was permanently locked out of that formal structure, no matter how much power, wealth, or trust he accumulated. And yet, and this is the part that makes his career genuinely remarkable, even by the standards of organized crime history, Lansky's influence inside that world was, by most accounts, unmatched by almost anyone who did hold formal membership. Joseph Bonanno, one of the founding bosses of New York's five families, would later summarize it bluntly: Lansky was a financial genius behind Luciano's success. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a capo. He didn't sit on the commission in the way Italian bosses did. But when it came to money, how to make it, how to move it, how to hide it, how to grow it, Lansky was, by the estimation of the men who actually ran the American Mafia, the single most important mind in the entire operation. This dual status, deeply embedded in the machinery of organized crime, yet permanently an outsider to its formal hierarchy, is precisely why Lansky earned the nicknames that would follow him for the rest of his life: the mob's accountant, the chairman of the board, later, more grandly, the godfather of the godfathers. He wasn't a man who gave the orders for violence. He was a man who made sure that whatever violence produced, whatever bootlegging the gambling, the rackets generated, actually turned into something durable, something that could survive Prohibition's end, survive law enforcement crackdowns, survive the deaths and imprisonments of the men around him, and keep generating wealth for decades. And this, right here, is the exact seed that would grow, more than 40 years later, into a fictional character named Hyman Roth, not a boss who ruled through fear like the fictional Corleones, a boss who ruled through arithmetic. By the mid-1930s, with Prohibition repealed in 1933 and the original bootlegging gold rush over, the syndicate Lansky had helped architect didn't collapse. It adapted, the way any well-run business adapts when its primary product becomes obsolete. Gambling became the new frontier, and here Lansky's specific genius came fully into focus. He didn't just run gambling operations. He understood gambling as an industry that could be professionalized, scaled, and, crucially, eventually legitimized in the right jurisdiction. He built out operations in Florida, in New Orleans through partnerships with local operators like Carlos Marcello's networks, and in a partnership that would come to define much of the rest of his career in Cuba. Meanwhile, out west, his oldest friend Bugsy Siegel was building a very different kind of reputation. Sent to the West Coast in the mid-1930s to oversee the syndicate's interest in Los Angeles gambling, the horse racing wire service that fed betting information nationwide, and the increasingly lucrative narcotics pipeline running up from Mexico, Siegel didn't just do the job. He fell in love with Hollywood. He became a fixture of the glamorous Los Angeles social scene, rubbing shoulders with movie stars, cultivating a public image as much as a criminal empire, funding his lifestyle with the same syndicate money he was supposed to be managing responsibly. It's worth sitting for a moment on the strange emotional core of the Lansky-Siegel relationship, because it's going to matter enormously later in this story. And it's a piece of the history the movie only gestures at through the fictionalized dynamic between Michael Corleone and Frank Pentangeli, or through Roth's cold, business-like demeanor. Lansky and Siegel weren't just business partners. They were, by every account that survives, genuine childhood friends. Two boys from the same poverty-stricken blocks of the Lower East Side who had built an empire together from nothing. And as their paths diverged, Lansky becoming increasingly disciplined and financially minded, Siegel becoming increasingly reckless and image-obsessed. That friendship was about to be tested in a way that would produce one of the most infamous decisions in American crime history and one of the most iconic scenes in The Godfather Part II, because Siegel's Hollywood fixation eventually curdled into an obsession of a different kind. He became consumed with the idea of building something no one else in organized crime had yet attempted, a glamorous, resort-style casino hotel in the middle of the Nevada desert, in a dusty railroad town that had only recently legalized gambling, a town called Las Vegas. He called it the Flamingo, and the story of what happened to that hotel and to the man who built it is where our story is about to head next, into a hotel ballroom in Havana, Cuba, in the final week of December 1946, where roughly 24 of the most powerful criminals in the United States gathered under the cover of a Christmas vacation to decide, among other things, what to do about their friend. Before we cross that bridge, it's worth pausing to notice something about how The Godfather Part II actually handles this entire first act of history. Because it doesn't really. It can't. Coppola and co-writer Mario Puzo had roughly 3.5 hours of screen time to tell a sprawling, multi-generational saga spanning Vito Corleone's Sicilian childhood, his rise in New York, and Michael Corleone's descent into moral ruin across the 1950s. There simply wasn't room in that structure for a scene explaining Atlantic City in 1929, or the mechanics of the Castellamarese War, or the specific architecture of how Jewish and Italian crime networks fused into a single national syndicate. Instead, the film compresses all of that historical machinery into character and mood. Michael Corleone's fictional family empire is presented as already fully formed, already national in scope, already operating with a kind of multi-ethnic sophistication that took men like Lansky, Luciano, Torrio, and Costello to decades of actual, grinding historical effort to build. When Michael sits across from Hyman Roth in Havana, discussing a joint venture to formally legitimize and expand casino operations, the film is essentially showing you the end product of the Atlantic City philosophy. Cooperation across ethnic and family lines in service of shared, quasi-legitimate business venture, without ever showing you the messy, violent, decades-long process that actually built that cooperative structure in the first place. That's not a criticism of the film. By the way, every adaptation compresses history to fit a story. But it does mean that if you only know this world to The Godfather, you're missing the actual origin story. You're missing Johnny Torrio, the retired Chicago boss reinventing himself as an elder statesman. You're missing a wedding in Atlantic City that may or may not have been the real reason 4 days of meetings changed the future of American crime. You're missing the specific, deliberate exclusion of the Mustache Pete's, the old guard whose entire worldview had to be violently erased before the new one could take hold. And you're missing the peculiar, complicated position of a Jewish immigrant kid from Grodno, who became, by universal underworld consensus, the single most financially important man in an organization he could never formally join. All of that is a real foundation Hyman Roth was built on top of, and now, with that foundation in place, we're ready for the meeting that actually inspired the movie's most famous set piece, the one that plays out on a Havana hotel rooftop, over a birthday cake shaped like Cuba, while Michael Corleone watches a fictional version of Meyer Lansky calmly explain how the future of organized crime is going to work. Except the real meeting didn't happen on a rooftop. It didn't happen over a birthday cake. And the decision made inside that room in Havana wasn't really about carving up Cuba at all. Not at first. It was about what to do with a friend who'd stopped listening. Let's go to Havana. To understand why roughly 24 of the most dangerous men in America chose, of all places, a hotel in Havana, to hold what may be the most consequential closed-door meeting in the history of organized crime, you have to start with one man's very complicated homecoming. By 1946, Charles Lucky Luciano was not supposed to be anywhere near the Western Hemisphere's criminal underworld. He was supposed to be in Sicily, permanently, for the rest of his life. During the war years, Luciano had been serving a staggering 30 to 50-year prison sentence for compulsory prostitution charges, a conviction many historians view as at least partly politically motivated, aimed squarely at the most powerful organized crime figure in New York. But the war changed his fortunes. U.S. military intelligence, worried about sabotage and enemy infiltration along the New York waterfront, and later, as the Allies planned the invasion of Sicily, eager for whatever local contacts and cooperation Sicilian-American networks could provide, reportedly reached out through intermediaries, including Meyer Lansky and Doc Boss Joseph Sox Lanza, to Luciano himself. In exchange for his cooperation, New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey agreed in 1946 to commute Luciano's sentence on one absolute, non-negotiable condition. Luciano would be deported to Italy, and he would never be allowed to set foot on American soil again. For most men, that would be the end of the story. For Luciano, it was closer to a temporary inconvenience, because Luciano had no intention of simply disappearing into Sicilian retirement while a new generation of bosses, men he had personally installed and empowered, ran his old operations without him. So in October 1946, in a sequence of moves that reads like something out of a spy thriller, Luciano quietly boarded a freighter in Naples under a false identity, sailing first to Venezuela, then flying to Rio de Janeiro, then to Mexico City, before finally arranging a private flight into the Cuban town of Camagüey. Waiting for him when he landed was his old friend and financial partner, Meyer Lansky. Why Cuba, specifically? Partly geography, close enough to the United States for American mob business to be conducted in person, far enough away to sit outside direct U.S. jurisdiction. But mostly it was because of the work Lansky had already been quietly doing for the better part of a decade, cultivating relationships inside the Cuban government and the island's tourism and gambling infrastructure. Relationships that, as we're about to see, ran all the way to the top of Cuban political power. With those connections greasing the way, Luciano passed through Cuban customs without so much as a raised eyebrow and was driven directly to Hotel Nacional de Cuba, the grand, colonnaded hilltop hotel overlooking the Havana waterfront that would, within weeks, become the unofficial capital of American organized crime. Word went out quietly through the syndicate's channels. Come to Havana. Officially, the pretext was simple and even a little charming. The boys were gathering to celebrate the holidays together, and not coincidentally, to celebrate a milestone birthday for a rising young singer named Frank Sinatra, who arrived in Havana that December accompanied by the Fischetti brothers, Chicago mob associates with deep ties to Al Capone's old organization. Sinatra's presence gave the whole gathering a layer of glamorous cover, a party, a celebration. Nothing more sinister than powerful men enjoying a tropical Christmas. But underneath the cover story, this was business, serious business. During the week of December 22nd through the 26th, 1946, an estimated 22 to 23 of the most powerful organized crime bosses in the United States converged on the Hotel Nacional. The roster reads like a who's who of the National Crime Syndicate's leadership. Luciano, presiding as the acknowledged boss of bosses despite his fugitive status. Meyer Lansky, serving simultaneously as financial architect and de facto meeting organizer. Frank Costello, the smooth diplomatic operator, increasingly known in press coverage as the Prime Minister of the Underworld. Albert Anastasia, the volatile, feared enforcer nicknamed the Executioner. Vito Genovese, an ambitious and increasingly restless rival to Luciano's authority. Santo Trafficante Sr., whose Florida-based organization would go on to become one of the most powerful mafia families operating in and around Cuba for the next decade. And representatives from virtually every major crime family across the country, from New York to Chicago to Tampa to New Orleans, all gathered under one roof. Let's be clear about what this meeting actually was, because it's easy, watching the fictionalized version, to think of it as a party with some business sprinkled in. It was close to the opposite, a formal, working commission meeting of America's National Crime Syndicate, conducted with an agenda, held in a country chosen specifically because it sat outside direct U.S. federal jurisdiction, disguised brilliantly as a holiday vacation. What exactly did the men in that hotel actually discuss over those several days? The historical record, pieced together primarily from later accounts, including the controversial but widely cited Last Testament of Lucky Luciano, compiled by writers Martin Gosch and Richard Hammer from extensive interviews Luciano gave before his death, paint a picture of an organization doing what organizations do, settling internal power struggles, discussing expansion strategy, and dealing with a problem employee. The power struggle came first, and it centered on the uneasy relationship between Luciano and Vito Genovese. According to Luciano's own later account, Genovese used a private meeting at the Hotel Nacional to press an uncomfortable truth. The U.S. government was well aware that Luciano had illegally re-entered the Western Hemisphere, and Cuban officials were already coming under pressure to expel him. If Luciano was inevitably going to be forced back to Italy, Genovese argued, wouldn't it make sense for him to formally hand over control of his New York family and step back from active leadership of the broader syndicate? Now, while he could still do it on his own terms, it was, in other words, a bid for power dressed up as practical advice, and Luciano, according to his own retelling, saw through it immediately. Rather than simply refuse, Luciano moved to neutralize the threat in the most theatrical way available to him. He orchestrated a public reconciliation between Genovese and Albert Anastasia, two men whose rivalry threatened to reignite exactly the kind of bloody internal war the syndicate had been built since Atlantic City in 1929 to prevent. By having the two men shake hands in front of the assembled bosses, Luciano simultaneously defused a dangerous rivalry and reasserted his own authority as a man still capable of keeping the peace. A pointed, symbolic answer to Genovese's suggestion that Luciano's leadership was already finished. With that internal drama resolved, at least temporarily, the agenda moved to expansion. Specifically, discussions around the syndicate's growing narcotics trafficking operations and a much larger, far more consequential conversation about Cuba itself. It was here, according to most historical accounts, that Luciano gave his formal blessing to a plan Lansky had already been quietly developing for years, a coordinated effort to transform Havana into the syndicate's next great gambling frontier, an open city for organized crime, built through casino investment, hotel development, and crucially, the cultivation of exactly the kind of political protection that made such an operation possible. For major American crime families, according to the arrangement discussed and confirmed in Havana, would oversee different pieces of the emerging Cuban gambling operation, dividing up the island's potential the way earlier bosses had once divided up Prohibition-era bootlegging territory. We're going to spend the entirety of our next act unpacking exactly what that Cuban gambling empire became and exactly how it collapsed. But first, the meeting had one more item of business, the one that would eventually inspire the most memorable scene in The Godfather Part II. Lansky is reported to have introduced the topic himself, with characteristic understatement, calling it simply the Siegel situation. And notably, pointedly, the man at the center of that agenda item was not in the room to defend himself. Bugsy Siegel had not been informed of the meeting. He had not been invited. He was, quite deliberately, the subject being discussed rather than a participant in the discussion. The problem, in blunt financial terms, was this. Siegel had been sent out west in the mid-1930s to help establish and oversee the syndicate's Los Angeles gambling operations, the horse racing information wire service that fed illegal bookmaking across the country, and coordination of narcotics shipments moving up from Mexico. Somewhere along the way, Siegel had become fixated on an idea that, at the time, struck many of his own partners as either visionary or reckless, depending on who you asked. Building a glamorous, full-scale resort casino in Las Vegas, Nevada, a dusty desert town that had legalized gambling, but had nothing resembling the kind of luxury tourist infrastructure Siegel envisioned. Working through his old friend Lansky, Siegel secured New York Syndicate financing to build what he called the Flamingo. The original budget, by most accounts, was somewhere around $1 million to $1.5 million, already an enormous sum for a Nevada casino project in the mid-1940s. By the time construction dragged into late 1946, that number had ballooned to somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 million, an almost five-fold overrun that immediately raised red flags among the very people who had put up the money. Was it dishonesty, or was it simple incompetence? The honest historical answer is probably some of both. Siegel, whatever his gifts as an enforcer and an organizer of criminal logistics, had no real background in construction or hotel development, and multiple accounts describe contractors taking brazen advantage of that inexperience, reportedly billing the project multiple times over for the same materials, such as palm trees purchased, delivered, and rebuilt again and again, each time padding invoices that Siegel, in over his head, apparently signed off on without close scrutiny. At the same time, suspicion fell heavily, and in the eyes of many of his partners, not without reason, on Siegel's relationship with his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, a woman with her own extensive underworld connections and a reputation, whether fully deserved or not, for moving money in and out of the project in ways that were difficult to trace. To men like Luciano, Costello, and Lansky, men who had spent 2 decades building a business culture explicitly designed to eliminate exactly this kind of costly, undisciplined chaos. A $6 million overrun on a still unfinished hotel represented, at minimum, gross financial mismanagement. At worst, it represented outright theft from syndicate partners, the single gravest sin in their entire business philosophy. And in that world at that time, the traditional remedy for that particular sin was rarely a strongly worded letter. According to Luciano's own later account, a vote was taken among the assembled bosses on what to do about Siegel, a vote from which, tellingly, both Lansky and his fellow Jewish syndicate partner Phil Castro abstained, given their personal closeness to the man being discussed. The result: Siegel, like the man voting to condemn him, Jewish by birth but operating at the highest levels of an organization historically dominated by Italian bosses, was sentenced to death. The contract, according to this account, was handed to Charles Fischetti of the Chicago outfit, to be carried out on the West Coast by Los Angeles crime boss Jack Dragna. Here is where the story turns genuinely, almost unbearably human, and it's worth sitting with, because it's the emotional core the movie tries, and largely fails, to capture in Hyman Roth's icy business calculus. Meyer Lansky was not simply a business partner discussing an underperforming asset. He was Bugsy Siegel's oldest friend in the world, a friendship stretching back more than 3 decades, to 2 teenage boys on the same poverty-stricken blocks of the Lower East Side, building a gang together out of nothing but ambition and nerve. When the vote came down against Siegel, Lansky did what account from fellow attendee Doc Stocker described as a passionate, personal appeal. He asked the assembled bosses to spare his friend. At minimum, he argued they should wait. The Flamingo, however over budget, however chaotically managed, was almost finished. Its grand opening was scheduled for December 26, mere days away, right at the tail end of this very meeting. Why not? Lansky pushed. See how the hotel actually performed before making an irreversible decision. If it succeeded, if it turned a profit, wouldn't that settle the question of Siegel's competence far more convincingly than another circular argument in a hotel room in Havana? It worked for a little while. The delegates, swayed by Lansky's appeal, agreed to hold off. They broke for Christmas Eve. Wives and girlfriends who had traveled down to Havana joined the festivities. The grand party thrown in honor of Sinatra's arrival unfolded against the backdrop of an unresolved death sentence hanging over an absent man 3,000 miles away. Then came the news from Las Vegas. The Flamingo's December 26th opening was, by nearly every account, a genuine flop. Poor initial turnout, operational problems, a hotel that, because construction still wasn't fully complete, couldn't even offer overnight accommodations to the gamblers it did attract, meaning many of the high rollers who showed up for opening night simply cashed out their winnings and drove back to Los Angeles rather than stay and keep playing. For the assembled bosses back in Havana, this wasn't just disappointing. It confirmed their worst suspicions. The reaction, by most historical descriptions, was fury, a demand, once again, for Siegel's head, this time with the added insult of a very public, very expensive failure attached to it. And once again, remarkably, Lansky intervened, buy his friend a little more time, urging patience, urging the bosses to let the Flamingo find its footing rather than pulling the trigger on a decision that, once made, could never be reversed. It was, in the end, only a delay, not a pardon. If you watch The Godfather Part II, you already know the scene this entire real-life meeting eventually inspired. Even if you never realized, until now, just how directly it was drawn from actual historical events. In the film, Hyman Roth celebrates his birthday on a Havana hotel rooftop, in front of an enormous cake sculpted, with almost comical extravagance, into the shape of the island of Cuba. As the cake is ceremonially cut, each slice symbolically representing a piece of the island being divided among the gathered guests, Roth calmly explains to Michael Corleone exactly how much money various American corporations have already sunk into Cuba, framing the island's future not as a matter of politics or nationalism, but as pure, cold business arithmetic. It's one of the most quietly chilling scenes in either Godfather film, not because anyone raises their voice, but because of exactly how casually the world's fate gets discussed over dessert. Now, you know where that scene actually comes from. Coppola and Puzo took the real 1946 Havana conference, the extended, multi-day, closed-door business meeting held at the Hotel Nacional, involving roughly 24 real crime bosses hammering out real territorial and financial arrangements for a real emerging Cuban gambling empire, and compressed it into a single, unforgettable image, a cake shaped like the country itself, carved up in front of the cameras. It's brilliant filmmaking. The cake works as visual shorthand for something that, in reality, took days of tense negotiation to actually settle. But it also flattens something important about the real history. The actual Havana Conference wasn't a single triumphant celebration of criminal conquest. It was messier than that, a meeting where a fugitive boss defended his authority against an ambitious rival, where the syndicate's Cuban gambling strategy was formally greenlit after years of groundwork, and where, almost as an afterthought on the agenda, one of the men in the room fought, twice, to save his oldest friend's life, and only partially succeeded. And notice what the film leaves out entirely. There is no equivalent, in The Godfather Part II, of the real emotional stakes of the Siegel situation. The film gives us Michael Corleone's cold, calculated elimination of Frank Pentangeli and later his own brother Fredo. Betrayal is dramatized with enormous emotional weight, because betrayal within a family is the entire thematic engine of the Godfather saga. But the real historical event that most closely mirrors those fictional betrayals, a boss voting with real anguish on whether to have his own childhood best friend murdered over money, happens almost entirely off-screen in the actual film, folded invisibly into the general atmosphere of the Havana meeting rather than dramatized directly. Hollywood, it turns out, borrowed the real Havana Conference's setting, its cast of characters, its central business logic, and then quietly declined to tell the single most human story that actually happened inside that hotel. You already know, in broad strokes, how this part of the story ends, because of one of the most famous unsolved murders in American crime history. Though unsolved, in the sense of formal criminal conviction, is different from unknown in terms of what most historians and law enforcement officials came to believe actually happened. The reprieve Lansky twice fought for in Havana didn't last. The Flamingo's early struggles continued into the new year. The financial hole Siegel had dug only got deeper, and the suspicion around Virginia Hill's handling of money never fully dissipated. On the night of June 20th, 1947, roughly 6 months after the Havana Conference wrapped, Bugsy Siegel was sitting in the living room of Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills mansion, reading a newspaper, when a still unidentified gunman fired multiple rounds to the front window with a .30 caliber military carbine. Siegel was struck several times, including a fatal shot to the head. He died instantly at 41 years old. No one was ever formally charged with the murder, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Almost immediately after Siegel's death, syndicate associates moved and take formal control of the Flamingo, the exact resort he had bled the organization's money to build, now suddenly profitable and firmly under new management. It was, in the coldest possible sense, exactly the outcome a business-minded organization would want. Remove the mismanagement, keep the asset. Here's the detail that matters most for our purposes, though. The detail that connects this real 1947 murder directly back to the character we're really here to talk about. Meyer Lansky, according to virtually every historical account of his life, never spoke publicly about his role, if any direct role existed, in the final decision to have his childhood best friend killed. He continued his career, continued building the Cuban gambling empire the Havana Conference had authorized, continued his ascent toward becoming the single most financially powerful figure in American organized crime. But biographers who spent years studying him consistently described Siegel's death as one of the only subjects Lansky was ever known to become visibly, uncharacteristically emotional discussing, a rare crack in the icy, unshakable calm that defined virtually every other public and private account of the man's demeanor. Ask yourself, how do you dramatize that? How do you put on screen the specific, private grief of a man who spent his entire adult life training himself never to show grief at all, over a decision he may or may not have had the power to stop? The honest answer is, you probably can't. Not in a way that would satisfy a 3-hour narrative feature film built around an entirely different family's fictional tragedy. So The Godfather Part II didn't try. It took the meeting, took the setting, took the underlying business logic of the Havana Conference and left the specific, unbearable weight of the Siegel situation almost entirely off the page, an absence that, once you know the real history, becomes its own kind of storytelling. We're about to follow Lansky and the syndicate deeper into the empire that Havana Conference actually authorized, the Cuban casino operation that would make Meyer Lansky one of the wealthiest and most powerful criminal figures in the world, that would entangle American organized crime directly with a sitting head of state, and that would, in less than 13 years, collapse overnight in a way none of the men gathered at the Hotel Nacional in December 1946 could have possibly predicted. That story starts with a dictator, a solid gold telephone, and an American ambassador with a gift that would come to symbolize everything wrong with the regime he was propping up. By the time the bosses gathered at the Hotel Nacional in December 1946 to formally bless the expansion of syndicate gambling into Cuba, Meyer Lansky had already been laying the groundwork for nearly a decade. This wasn't improvisation. This was a culmination of patient, methodical planning by a man whose entire professional identity was built around thinking further ahead than his rivals, and further ahead than the law enforcement agencies chasing him. Lansky's interest in Cuba dated back to the 1930s, a period when Prohibition's repeal had forced the syndicate to look for new revenue streams, and Lansky, characteristically, looked south. Cuba offered something almost nowhere in the continental United States could: a jurisdiction where gambling was legal, where the political system was pliable enough to be influenced with the right combination of money and patience, and where American tourists, flush with post-war prosperity and eager for an exotic, glamorous getaway just 90 miles from Florida, represented an almost bottomless well of potential customers. Havana in the 1930s and 40s was already developing a reputation as a playground for wealthy Americans. Rum, cigars, nightlife, casinos operating in a legal gray zone under loose Cuban gaming regulations. What Cuba needed, in Lansky's calculation, wasn't more casinos. It needed professionalized casinos, honest games, run by experienced operators, capable of attracting serious high-stakes gamblers who wouldn't trust their money to fly-by-night operations prone to rigged wheels and skimming. This was, in fact, one of the genuinely distinctive features of Lansky's approach to the gambling business throughout his entire career, and it's worth pausing on because it cuts against the popular image of mob-run casinos as inherently crooked. Lansky's operating philosophy, according to multiple biographers, was almost the opposite. Run a straight game. Don't cheat the customers. The house edge built into any legitimate casino game was already enormously profitable over time. Why risk a scandal, a lawsuit, or a reputation-destroying story by rigging games you didn't need to rig? It was, in its own way, exactly the kind of long-term, disciplined thinking that separated Lansky from more impulsive, short-term operators like his late friend Siegel. The key that would unlock this vision, though, wasn't just operational discipline. It was political access. And that access ran directly through one man, Fulgencio Batista. Fulgencio Batista's relationship with Cuban politics is a genuinely strange, twisting story in its own right, one that involved multiple periods of formal and informal rule, a stretch out of power entirely, and an eventual return via military coup. In the early 1930s, Batista rose to prominence as an army sergeant who helped orchestrate a coup against the Cuban government, positioning himself as the power behind a series of puppet presidents before formally winning the presidency himself in 1940. He served a constitutional term, stepped away from power for a period in the mid-1940s when political rival Ramon Grau won the presidency, and then, in a move that would prove decisive for organized crime's future on the island, seized power again in a 1952 military coup, this time ruling as an outright dictator, canceling scheduled elections and governing Cuba through force and patronage for the rest of the decade. It was during Batista's various periods in and around power, but especially during his second dictatorial stretch beginning in 1952, that his government forged a deep, mutually beneficial relationship with American organized crime that would come to define Havana's reputation for the next 7 years. Batista understood, with the same cold pragmatism Lansky brought to gambling, exactly what an alliance with the American mob could offer him. Massive foreign investment in Cuban tourism infrastructure, a reliable source of both legal and under-the-table income, and international glamour that helped legitimize his regime on the world stage, even as that same regime grew increasingly repressive and corrupt. So Batista brought Lansky in not as an outside operator to be tolerated, but as an actual government advisor, formally invited to help reorganize and expand Cuba's gambling sector under legal measures like the 1955 hotel law. The Cuban government began offering substantial public financial incentives specifically designed to spur construction of new luxury hotels and casinos. Some of these projects partially financed with public or semi-public Cuban funds, an arrangement that, unsurprisingly, generated persistent allegations of corruption, since the same officials approving these generous incentives were often the ones personally profiting from casino operations. Those incentives helped build, under this new framework, Havana transformed with startling speed into exactly the kind of glittering, mob-controlled gambling paradise the Havana Conference had envisioned back in 1946. Lansky personally took direct control of operations at some of the island's most prestigious properties, including the Hotel Nacional, the very same hotel that had hosted the historic 1946 conference, and later the Havana Riviera, a spectacular new hotel casino Lansky built essentially from the ground up, opening in 1957 as one of the most ambitious and modern casino resorts anywhere in the Western Hemisphere at the time. Alongside these flagship Lansky properties, other major American organized crime figures established their own footholds across the city. Sano Trafficani Jr., inheriting his father's growing Florida to Cuba pipeline, ran operations including the San Souci nightclub and later the Capri Hotel, whose casino, in one of history's stranger footnotes, briefly counted actor George Raft, a Hollywood star with his own long-rumored underworld connections, as its official host and public face. By the mid to late 1950s, Havana had become, in every meaningful sense, exactly what the 1946 conference had authorized, an open city for organized crime, operated with the explicit blessing and active participation of a sitting head of state, generating enormous profits that flowed both into syndicate coffers in the United States and into the personal enrichment of Batista's own government. Now let's talk about the Golden Telephone, because this is where the Godfather Part II's dramatization and the true historical record line up almost perfectly, and it's worth walking through exactly why. In the film, Michael Corleone stands in the room as Cuban officials formally present President Batista with an extravagant golden telephone, a gift from the fictionalized UTT Corporation, a barely disguised stand-in for the real telephone monopoly operating in Cuba at the time. The gift functions, in the film's visual language, as an almost obscene symbol of exactly how deeply American corporate and criminal money had penetrated Cuban political life, a literal golden object, handed to a head of state, purchased with the profits of ordinary Cuban telephone customers. Here's the astonishing part. The film didn't invent this. It happened. The real gift came from the Cuban Telephone Company, a subsidiary of the American telecommunications giant AT&T, and was presented to Batista by the actual sitting United States ambassador to Cuba at the time, Arthur Gardner, a diplomat whose tenure, from 1953 to 1957, was defined by an almost total alignment with Batista's interests. Gardner, according to historical accounts, was so closely aligned with the regime that he reportedly worked to actively obstruct the flow of information from the U.S. Embassy in Havana back to Washington that might have painted Batista in a critical light. A diplomat functioning, in practice, less like an independent observer and more like an extension of the regime's own public relations apparatus. The timing of the gift makes its symbolism even more pointed than the film's version conveys. According to detailed historical accounts, the golden telephone was presented to Batista the day after he survived an assassination attempt carried out by a student-led commando team, a dramatic, high-stakes moment when the dictator's grip on power had briefly and violently been called into question. Ambassador Gardner's congratulatory visit, complete with the extravagant gift, was a pointed public signal. The United States government, and by extension the powerful American corporate interests operating in Cuba, stood firmly behind Batista, regardless of the growing unrest simmering just beneath the surface of Cuban society. And the telephone company itself carried its own separate legacy of public resentment that made the gift land even harder with ordinary Cubans. Years earlier, in 1949, a national protest movement led by Cuban Senator Eduardo Chivas had forced the sitting Cuban president at the time, Carlos Prios Ocaraz, to reverse a deeply unpopular 50% rate increase the Cuban telephone company had imposed on its customers. It was Briefly, a genuine victory for ordinary Cubans against exactly the kind of corporate overreach that increasingly defined the era. But almost immediately after Batista seized power in his 1952 coup, deposing that same President Prio Socarrás, the telephone company quietly reimposed a very rate hike Cuban citizens had successfully fought to reverse just 3 years earlier. This time, with Batista's explicit backing, the increase stuck. So when Gardner presented that solid gold telephone, reportedly manufactured for the occasion by the same American-owned phone monopoly that had just re-victimized ordinary Cuban ratepayers with Batista's blessing, it wasn't received by anyone paying attention as a simple diplomatic courtesy. It became, almost instantly, a potent public symbol of everything wrong with the Batista regime: American corporate money, wrapped in gold, handed directly to a dictator who had enabled that same corporate exploitation of his own people, delivered by an American ambassador who had made no secret of his loyalty to Batista over any broader concern for Cuban democracy. That symbolism didn't fade after Batista's eventual fall. When Fidel Castro's revolutionary government took power in 1959, its newly formed Ministry for the Recuperation of National Patrimony, tasked with clawing back well-stolen or corruptly acquired during Batista years, auctioned off the original gold telephone specifically to raise funds for Cuba's rural poor, a deliberate, almost poetic act of turning the regime's most infamous symbol of corruption directly into support for the very people that corruption had exploited. Today, a version of the phone, sources differ on whether it's a fully original object or a period replica, sits on display at Havana's Museum of the Revolution, inside the former presidential palace, still functioning more than 70 years later, as exactly the symbol it became the moment Ambassador Gardner handed it over, a monument to how completely American money and American political backing had entangled itself with one of the most corrupt governments in the hemisphere. Watch that scene in The Godfather Part II again with this history in mind, and it plays completely differently. It's not really dramatic license at all. It's closer to reenactment. It's tempting, looking at Havana's casino boom purely through the lens of Sinatra performances, glamorous hotel openings, and American tourists sipping daiquiris under palm trees, to lose sight of exactly what kind of machine Lansky had actually built. Underneath the glamour was an extraordinarily sophisticated financial operation, one that historians studying Lansky's career consistently identify as a genuine turning point in the evolution of organized crime's relationship with money itself. Havana wasn't simply a casino town generating gambling profits. It was, functionally, a laundering apparatus of scale and sophistication that hadn't previously existed anywhere in the criminal underworld. Cash generated at casino tables, legitimate, tourist-driven gambling revenue, mixed freely with money that had originated from far less legitimate sources back in the United States, could be counted, skimmed, and moved through a combination of legal Cuban businesses and offshore financial channels in ways that made its ultimate origin nearly impossible for American investigators to trace. Lansky reportedly maintained accounts and business relationships stretching from Havana to the Bahamas to Switzerland, building out precisely the kind of international financial infrastructure that decades later will become standard practice for organized crime and, eventually, for corrupt regimes and cartels around the world. In a very real sense, modern money laundering is an industry. The elaborate use of shell companies, offshore banking, and legitimate-seeming business fronts to disguise the origin of legal wealth owes an enormous intellectual debt to techniques Lansky pioneered, refined, and scaled during exactly this period of his career, with Havana serving as his primary laboratory. And crucially, none of this operated in the shadows the way earlier eras of organized crime had been forced to, because of the Batista government's direct complicity. Bribes flowing to Cuban officials, police, and military officers to guarantee the casinos operated without interference, while Batista himself reportedly took a direct personal cut of casino profits as part of the arrangement. Lansky's Cuban operation enjoyed a level of protection and stability that would have been unthinkable for organized crime operating inside the United States, where local police corruption, however real, never came close to matching the wholesale cooperation of an entire national government. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it's the exact quality that made Cuba, in the eyes of men like Lansky and Luciano, genuinely different from every previous criminal territory the syndicate had ever controlled. Las Vegas, however lucrative, still operated inside the United States, under at least nominal state and federal oversight, with a constant background risk of federal investigation, congressional hearings, and prosecution. Cuba, under Batista, offered something closer to sovereign immunity, a literal country whose head of state had a direct, ongoing financial stake in seeing organized crimes of Havana operations succeed. For a man who had spent his entire career trying to build criminal enterprises durable enough to survive law enforcement pressure, this must have felt, for a brief and glittering decade, like he had finally solved the problem completely. He hadn't. He had simply tied his entire empire's fate to the survival of a single, deeply unpopular dictator. And dictators, history has a habit of reminding people, do not last forever. Throughout the 1950s, even as Havana's casino district glittered brighter than ever, the political ground underneath Batista's regime was steadily eroding. His 1952 coup, which had canceled scheduled Democratic elections and installed him as an unelected dictator, generated deep and lasting resentment among ordinary Cubans, resentment that only intensified as the years wore on and Batista's government grew more openly repressive, using police and military force to suppress political opposition, while the visible wealth flowing into casino districts controlled by American gangsters and their Cuban political partners stood in stark, infuriating contrast to the poverty experienced by much of the island's rural population. A young, previously obscure lawyer and political agitator named Fidel Castro had been building an armed resistance movement against Batista's government since the mid-1950s, following a failed initial assault on a military barracks in 1953 that landed Castro briefly in prison, followed by exile, followed by a small guerrilla landing back in Cuba in late 1956 that nearly ended in complete disaster before Castro and a small surviving cadre of fighters, including his brother Raul and the Argentine revolutionary Che Guevara, retreated into the Sierra Maestra Mountains to rebuild and slowly expand their insurgency over the following 2 years. American diplomatic and business support for Batista, meanwhile, was beginning to fracture even before Castro's movement gained decisive momentum. Ambassador Arthur Gardner himself, the same man who had presented Batista with that golden telephone, was pressured to resign his ambassadorship in 1957, in part because his relentlessly pro-Batista stance had made him unable or unwilling to accurately communicate to Washington the depth of unrest and the growing brutality of Batista's crackdowns on the 26th of July movement. Castro's revolutionary organization. His successor found the situation deteriorating further, and by March of 1958, the United States government took the extraordinary step of imposing an arms embargo on Batista's own government and formally recalling its ambassador, a dramatic public signal that Washington's confidence in Batista's ability to maintain control was crumbling in real time. Batista's remaining support among ordinary Cubans, already thin, continued fading as former backers either quietly joined the growing revolutionary movement or simply distanced themselves from a regime that increasingly looked doomed. Did the men running Havana's casino industry see any of this coming? It's a question worth sitting with, because the honest answer complicates the popular image of Lansky as an all-seeing financial genius who anticipated every risk. By most accounts, Lansky and his fellow casino operators continued investing aggressively in Cuba right up until the very end. Lansky's own Havana Riviera, a genuinely enormous capital investment, opened in December of 1957, less than 14 months before the entire regime that made it possible would collapse completely. Whether this reflects genuine strategic miscalculation, simple confidence that Batista's American-backed military would ultimately hold the line against a comparatively small guerrilla insurgency, or a calculated bet that even a change in government wouldn't necessarily threaten a genuinely lucrative and popular tourism industry. The truth is probably some combination of all three, and it's a mistake that would ultimately cost Lansky and his partners more than any single miscalculation in their entire careers. The end, when it finally came, arrived with a speed that stunned virtually everyone. Inside and outside Cuba, inside and outside the casino industry that had built itself so completely on the assumption that Batista's government, however shaky, would somehow endure. By late December of 1958, Castro's forces, after more than 2 years of steadily expanding guerrilla warfare, had achieved a series of decisive military breakthroughs, most critically the capture of the strategically vital city of Santa Clara, led in that particular battle by Che Guevara. With his military position collapsing and his remaining political support evaporating, Batista made the decision, in the early hours of January 1st, 1959, to flee Cuba entirely, boarding a plane in the middle of the night, along with a small circle of loyal officials and family members, bound first for the Dominican Republic and eventually onward to exile in Portugal and later Spain, where he would live out the rest of his life, dying in 1973, having never returned to Cuba. This is, incidentally, the moment The Godfather Part II actually dramatizes most directly and most accurately, condensing years of building revolutionary momentum into a single, sudden New Year's Eve collapse that leaves Michael Corleone and his associates scrambling desperately for the exits as Havana descends into chaos around them. In that regard, the film's compression of history is actually fairly faithful to how the collapse genuinely felt to the people caught inside it. Batista's government hadn't crumbled gradually, in a way anyone could plan around. It had held on, and then simply ended almost overnight for Lansky and his fellow casino operators. The timing could hardly have been worse, and the fall itself was only the beginning of the disaster. As word of Batista's flight spread through Havana, furious crowds, having endured years of visible criminal wealth flourishing under a regime that had impoverished and repressed much of the island, turned their anger directly on the physical symbols of that wealth. Casino equipment was smashed. Slot machines were dragged into the streets and destroyed. Some hotel casino properties suffered significant vandalism and looting in the immediate, chaotic days following Batista's departure, before Castro's incoming revolutionary government moved to restore order. And once that new government was firmly in control, its policy toward the mob's Cuban empire was swift and absolute. Fidel Castro's administration formally nationalized virtually all of the island's major hotel casinos, seizing them as state property, and outlawed gambling entirely, dismantling, in the space of a few short months, an entire industry that Lansky had spent nearly 3 decades methodically building. The financial scale of what Lansky lost is genuinely staggering, even accounting for the notorious difficulty of pinning down exact figures for a man whose entire life's work had been specifically engineered to defy precise accounting. Some estimates place his personal holdings tied up in Cuban casino operations at the moment of the revolution in the range of tens of millions of dollars. One commonly cited figure puts Lansky's Cuban-connected wealth, immediately before the collapse, at approximately $20 million, an almost unfathomable sum in 1959 dollars, equivalent to well over $200 million in modern purchasing power. All of it, in the span of a single revolutionary transition, effectively vanished, seized by a new government with zero intention of compensating the American gangsters and corrupt Batista-era officials who had extracted so much wealth from the island for so long. Understand what this actually represented in the broader arc of Lansky's career and in the larger context of American organized crime history. The Cuban gambling empire wasn't simply one successful venture among many for Lansky. It was, by most historical accounts, the single most ambitious and most successful project of his entire life, the fullest realization of the vision he had first started developing back in the 1930s and had formally secured the syndicate's backing for at that 1946 Havana conference. It represented the closest organized crime in America had ever come to achieving something like sovereign-level protection for its most lucrative operations, a literal alliance with a head of state, insulating the entire enterprise from the kind of law enforcement pressure that had always been the syndicate's greatest vulnerability inside the United States. And it collapsed in a matter of weeks, destroyed not by federal prosecutors, not by rival gangsters, not by any of the threats organized crime had spent decades learning to defend against, but by a political revolution that swept away the entire foundation the empire had been built on. There's a genuinely important lesson buried in this collapse, one that both the real history and the fictional Godfather Part II narrative both, in their own ways, try to grapple with. That organized crime's greatest vulnerability was never really law enforcement at all. It was politics, the fundamentally unstable, ultimately uncontrollable foundation of relying on a single government's cooperation, a single dictator's continued grip on power, to protect an enterprise that had no legal standing to fall back on once that political protection disappeared. Lansky, by every account, took the loss of Cuba as one of the most significant setbacks of his entire career. Though, characteristically, he didn't collapse or panic. He pivoted, as he always had, looking for the next jurisdiction where the same basic playbook might work again. The Bahamas, where he spent much of the 1960s helping establish a new offshore gambling operation under a different political arrangement, again cultivating relationships with local officials, again building out casino infrastructure designed to attract American tourists and launder syndicate money through what looked, on paper, like a legitimate tourism-driven economy. But nothing Lansky built afterward ever quite matched the scale, the audacity, or the sheer completeness of what Cuba had represented at its peak, an entire island functionally operating as an extension of his financial empire, protected at the very highest level of a sovereign government. And back in the United States, even as Lansky worked to rebuild in the Bahamas, a much older and far more persistent threat was steadily closing in. Federal investigators, congressional committees, and the Internal Revenue Service, all of whom had spent decades trying and largely failing to build a case against the one organized crime figure who had always been smart enough and careful enough to stay just barely out of their reach. That pursuit, the decades-long cat-and-mouse game between Meyer Lansky and American law enforcement, culminating in a flight to Israel, the courtroom battles, and the strange, quiet final act of his life, is where we're headed next. And it's also where we finally arrive at the character this entire story has been building toward, Hyman Roth, the fictional version of Lansky that Lee Strasberg brought to the screen in 1974, and exactly how and how much that portrayal diverged from the real man sitting in a Miami Beach apartment, watching his own legend play out in movie theaters across the country he'd spent his whole life trying to outmaneuver. By the time producer Robert Evans and director Francis Ford Coppola began assembling the cast for The Godfather Part II in the early 1970s, Meyer Lansky wasn't some distant, half-forgotten figure from organized crime's Prohibition-era past. He was, at that very moment, one of the most actively pursued men in America, under federal indictment for tax evasion, a fugitive living in Israel while he fought a landmark legal battle for citizenship, his name appearing regularly in newspaper coverage that speculated wildly about the true size of his hidden fortune. In other words, when audiences sat down in theaters in December 1974 to watch a fictional Jewish gangster named Hyman Roth manipulate his way through a joint venture in pre-revolutionary Cuba, the character on screen was inspired by ancient history. He was inspired by a headline still actively unfolding in real time. For the role, Coppola made a genuinely unusual casting choice. Lee Strasberg, the legendary acting teacher and founder of the Actors Studio, one of the most influential figures in 20th century American drama, who had spent decades shaping the careers of actors like Marlon Brando, Al Pacino, and Marilyn Monroe through his teaching of method acting technique, but who had almost no film acting career of his own to speak of. Strasberg was in his early 70s when he took the role, reportedly initially reluctant to appear on screen at all, more comfortable behind the scenes shaping other active performances than delivering one himself. What he brought to Hyman Roth, though, turned out to be exactly what the character needed. A quiet, weathered authority, a stillness that made every word feel weighted, and a physical frailty that the film would use as one of its most devastating narrative tools. Strasberg's performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and it remains, nearly 50 years later, one of the most quietly menacing performances in American film history. Precisely because Roth never raises his voice, never threatens anyone directly, never does anything that looks, on the surface, like the behavior of a movie gangster. He simply talks about money, calmly, patiently, the way an accountant might discuss a difficult but ultimately manageable quarterly loss. It's a performance built entirely around the idea that the most dangerous men in the world are rarely the ones who look dangerous. That idea, more than any single plot point or line of dialogue, is the truest thing the film gets about Meyer Lansky. Everything else, as we're about to see, required significant embellishment, invention, and outright fictional license. Let's start with the single most consequential dramatic device the film builds around Hyman Roth's character, his illness. Throughout The Godfather Part II, Roth is presented as a man near death, frail, weakened, repeatedly suffering what appear to be heart episodes at moments of high tension, his physical decline used by other characters, and by the audience, as a kind of built-in sympathy generator, a sense that whatever schemes Roth is running, he's an old, dying man doing it, which somehow makes his manipulations feel less purely villainous, and more like the last desperate maneuvers of someone running out of time. And then, in one of the film's most memorable late-story twists, Michael Corleone comes a suspect, correctly. As it turns out, that at least some of Roth's apparent physical collapses have been exaggerated or outright faked. Strategic performances of vulnerability designed to manipulate the people around him, including Michael himself, into underestimating exactly how dangerous and calculating he still is. It's a brilliant piece of character writing. It's also almost entirely fictional when measured against the real Meyer Lansky of the 1946 to 1959 period the film's Cuba storyline is drawing from. Here's the plain historical truth. During the years the film's Havana storyline is actually set the mid-1950s, in the final years before Batista's fall, Meyer Lansky was in his early to mid-50s, at the absolute height of his physical vigor, his political influence, and his financial power. This was not a dying man clinging to relevance. This was a man actively building the single most ambitious project of his career, personally overseeing the construction and operation of major hotel casinos, cultivating relationships with the sitting head of state, and running what amounted to an international financial empire spanning multiple countries and currencies. The real Lansky of this era was, by every account, sharp, energetic, and firmly in command, not physically failing, not manipulating sympathy through feigned weakness, but simply doing what he had always done, managing an enormous, complicated criminal enterprise with cold, methodical precision. Lansky's real physical decline came much later, and for reasons that had nothing to do with dramatic manipulation. He suffered his first heart attack more than a decade after the period the film depicts, sometime in the 1960s, and by the early 1970s, around the actual time of his flight to Israel and subsequent legal battles. He genuinely was in poor health. Chronic heart trouble, bronchitis, ulcers, arthritis, and bursitis, conditions serious enough that court-appointed doctors would later cite them as a significant factor in his tax evasion trial. He even underwent open-heart surgery in March of 1973. But this genuine physical decline belongs to a completely different chapter of his life than the Cuba storyline the film is dramatizing, a chapter roughly 15 to 20 years later, when Lansky was in his 70s rather than his 50s. So what the film effectively does is take the real, documented frailty of an elderly Lansky fighting deportation charges in the early 1970s and graft it backward onto a fictional character operating in a Cuban storyline set nearly 2 decades earlier, during a period when a real man was, if anything, at the absolute peak of his powers. It's a completely understandable choice from a storytelling perspective. Roth's illness, real or performed, gives Michael Corleone something concrete to react to, a vulnerability to probe, and eventually exploit, a dramatic mechanism the plot genuinely needs. But it means that audiences watching The Godfather Part II have spent 50 years absorbing an image of a frail, dying Meyer Lansky during exactly the period when a real man was actually least frail, least dying, and most dangerously in control of his empire. If there's a single line of dialogue in The Godfather Part II that has become permanently associated with Meyer Lansky in popular culture, it's Hyman Roth's calm, almost wistful observation about the sheer scale of what organized crime had actually built, a line that essentially argues that the American mob, taken as a collective financial enterprise, had grown into something bigger and more powerful than one of the largest, most iconic corporations in American industrial history. This line is an invention of screenwriters Coppola and Mario Puzo. It's drawn almost verbatim from something the real Meyer Lansky is widely reported to have actually said. According to Lansky's New York Times obituary, published after his death in January of 1983, Lansky once boasted to an underworld associate, "We're bigger than U.S. Steel." Other biographical accounts describe a slightly different version of the origin story. Federal investigators, who had Lansky under surveillance and wiretap for years, reportedly overheard him make a similar remark while watching a television news report about the scale of organized crime's economic footprint in America, responded with characteristic dry confidence that the criminal syndicate he'd helped build had, in pure economic terms, already surpassed one of the great symbols of legitimate American industrial power, whichever specific version is most accurate, and it's entirely possible both are true. Separate instances of Lansky returning to a boast he was clearly proud of. The underlying claim reflects something that historians studying organized crime's economic scale in the mid-20th century generally treat as at least directionally credible. By the 1960s and 70s, American organized crime, taken collectively across gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, loan sharking, and increasingly sophisticated laundering operations Lansky himself had helped pioneer, was generating revenue streams that genuinely rivaled major legitimate industries. U.S. Steel, for its part, was at that time one of the largest and most iconic corporations in the American economy, a symbol of industrial might dating back to its founding in 1901 as, at the time, the largest corporation in the world. For Lansky to claim his own criminal enterprise had eclipsed, it wasn't just braggadocio. It was, by most economic estimates of organized crime scale during that era, a claim with real substance behind it. What makes this detail so effective as a piece of characterization, both in the real historical record and in its fictionalized film version, is what it reveals about how Lansky actually understood his own life's work. He wasn't measuring his success against other gangsters, the way a more traditionally violent boss might boast about territory controlled or rivals eliminated. He was measuring himself against the largest, most legitimate corporate institutions in American capitalism, framing organized crime not as an underworld phenomenon operating in society's shadows, but as a genuine parallel economy, sophisticated and powerful enough to be discussed in the same breath as the titans of legitimate American industry. It's the single clearest window available into how Lansky saw himself, not as a criminal outsider, but as a businessman who happened to operate in an illegal industry, a distinction that, in his own mind at least, seems to have mattered enormously. Now, let's talk about the plot mechanics that actually drive the Godfather Part II's Roth storyline forward. Because here, the gap between fiction and history opens up into something close to a chasm. In the film, the relationship between Michael Corleone and Hyman Roth curdles into open warfare. Roth, it's revealed, was secretly behind an assassination attempt on Michael's life, orchestrated in retaliation for the earlier murder of Roth's own longtime associate, Mo Green, a fictional Las Vegas casino boss whose death, back in the first Godfather film, Michael had ordered as part of consolidating control over the family's gambling interests. From that point forward, the second film escalates into an increasingly personal, deadly cat-and-mouse conflict between the two men, culminating in Roth's fictional death at that Miami airport, gunned down by an assassin working, ambiguously, either on Michael's orders or as a kind of ironic, poetic justice delivered by history itself. None of this, the assassination attempt, the personal vendetta, the escalating spiral of retaliation between a Corleone-style family boss and a Lansky-style financial mastermind, has any direct real-world counterpart. This is more than almost any other element of Roth's character, pure narrative invention, built to serve the Godfather saga's own internal thematic logic, rather than to dramatize anything that actually happened between Meyer Lansky and any specific rival. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it gets at something important about how the entire film handles history. The Godfather Part II isn't a documentary, and it was never trying to be one. Puzo and Coppola were building on the fictional Corleone family saga established in the first film, and Michael Corleone's arc across the sequel is fundamentally about the corrosive, isolating cost of absolute power, a man who, by systematically eliminating every perceived threat and betrayal around him, ends the film utterly alone, having destroyed his own family in the process to try to protect it. Roth exists in that story primarily as an antagonist whose fictional death serves Michael's tragic arc, a final, hollow victory that costs Michael something essential about his own humanity, underscored by the film's devastating final act, in which Michael also orders the murder of his own brother, Fredo. The real power struggles inside organized crime during the era the film draws from looked nothing like this. They were rarely personal vendettas between individual rivals, settled through dramatic, climactic confrontations. They were, as we saw in Act II's account of the actual 1946 Havana Conference, closer to committee decisions, votes taken by assembled bosses, business disputes settled through negotiation, reconciliation, or, when necessary, coldly efficient contract killings carried out at a careful remove from the men who authorized them. Vito Genovese's attempted power grab against Luciano at the real Havana Conference, for instance, was diffused not through violence but through a carefully staged public handshake designed to save face on all sides. Even the decision to kill Bugsy Siegel, arguably the single most personally fraught decision described anywhere in this entire history, was reached through a formal vote among the assembled leadership, not a unilateral act of vengeance by any one boss settling a personal score. In other words, the real National Crime Syndicate that Lansky helped build was specifically designed, from its founding principles at Atlantic City in 1929 onward, to minimize exactly the kind of personal, escalating vendettas that drive so much of The Godfather's dramatic tension. That was the entire point of the syndicate structure, replacing the older, blood feud-driven model of Mustache Pete-era organized crime with something closer to a corporate governance system, where disputes got resolved through negotiation and collective decision-making rather than personal wars of retaliation. The real Meyer Lansky spent his entire career trying to prevent exactly the kind of destructive, personal conflict that defines Michael Corleone and Hyman Roth's fictional relationship, which raises an interesting question worth sitting with as we move toward the story's real conclusion. If the actual history Lansky lived through was fundamentally about avoiding dramatic, personal confrontation in favor of quiet, collective, business-like decision-making, what does it mean that Hollywood needed to invent a personal blood feud, complete with assassination attempts and a climactic airport killing, in order to give his fictional counterpart a satisfying ending? We'll come back to that question directly. But first, there's one more piece of the Roth versus Lansky comparison left to examine, and it comes not from historians or biographers, but reportedly from Lansky himself. Of all the details connecting the real Meyer Lansky to his fictional counterpart, none is more strangely, quietly human than the story of what happened after The Godfather Part II premiered in December of 1974. According to accounts that have circulated for decades in profiles and retrospectives of both the film and Lansky's life, the real Lansky, at that point back in the United States, having recently been acquitted at his tax evasion trial, living quietly in Miami Beach, reportedly reached out to Lee Strasberg after seeing the film, or after learning of the performance that had earned Strasberg an Academy Award nomination for playing a character everyone understood to be modeled directly on him. And according to this account, rather than expressing anger, outrage, or a threat of legal action, any of which might have been the expected response from a man watching his own criminal legacy dramatized on movie screens across the country, Lansky reportedly offered something closer to a mild, almost wistful critique. "You could have made me more sympathetic," he is said to have told Strasberg. "After all, I am a grandfather." It's worth pausing on how strange revealing this alleged remark actually is. If the account is accurate, it's not a denial. It's not an objection to being portrayed as a criminal at all. By 1974, Lansky had spent decades as one of the most publicly discussed organized crime figures in America. There was no meaningful world in which he could claim the association was unfair or inaccurate. Instead, his reported complaint is almost purely about tone, about sympathy, a request, essentially, that the film should have done more to humanize him, to show the version of himself that existed outside the criminal enterprise, a husband, a father, and by 1974, a grandfather, a man whose family life apparently mattered enough to him, that its absence from the film's portrayal genuinely seemed to bother him. This detail, more than any single historical fact about the Havana Conference or the Golden Telephone or the National Crime Syndicate's founding, might be the single best window we have into how Meyer Lansky understood his own life and legacy. He didn't dispute that he built one of the most powerful criminal empires in American history. He didn't dispute that Hollywood had every right to dramatize that empire on screen. What he apparently wanted, what he seems to have genuinely felt was missing from Hyman Roth portrayal, was some acknowledgement that the man behind the empire had also lived an ordinary, quiet domestic life running parallel to the extraordinary criminal one. Of family, relationships, the small human details that rarely survive translation into a 3-hour crime epic built around themes of power, betrayal, and moral collapse. It's a small, almost throwaway anecdote in the broader scope of the story, but it points directly toward a theme this entire investigation has been building toward, and the one we're about to fully unpack as we follow the real Lansky to the final act of his actual life. The gap between the dramatic, operatic version of organized crime that audiences want from their movies and the genuinely strange, mundane, often anticlimactic reality of how men like Lansky actually lived, aged, and eventually died. Because here's what's coming next in our story. The film needed Hyman Roth to die at that Miami airport. Needed a decisive, visually striking, morally weighted conclusion to close out his arc and deliver the kind of narrative payoff a 3-hour crime epic demands. The real Meyer Lansky, walking through an actual Miami airport in 1972, having just lost his desperate bid to stay in Israel, got nothing of the kind. He got a customs line. He got, eventually, a courtroom. And then, genuinely astonishingly, given everything he'd spent his life doing, he got to simply go home. What happened to Meyer Lansky after Israel deported him is, in its own quiet way, one of the strangest anticlimaxes in the entire history of American organized crime. And it's exactly where we're headed next. To understand why Meyer Lansky ended up on a plane bound for Israel in the summer of 1970, you have to understand just how long and how consistently unsuccessful the American government's pursuit of him had already been by that point. For nearly 50 years, across an active criminal career that stretched from Prohibition-era bootlegging to the founding of the National Crime Syndicate, through Havana's casino empire, through decades of gambling operations spanning Florida, Nevada, the Bahamas, and beyond, Meyer Lansky was arrested multiple times by federal and local authorities. And yet, remarkably, he was formally convicted of a crime serious enough to result in real prison time exactly once, a gambling-related violation in New York in 1953, which landed him behind bars for a grand total of 2 months. That's it, 2 months, across 5 decades of activity that the FBI itself, in its own internal assessments, considered central to the operation of organized crime in America. This wasn't luck. It was, according to virtually every biographer who studied Lansky's career, the direct product of the exact same discipline and foresight that had made him so valuable to the syndicate in the first place. Lansky rarely, if ever, put anything directly in his own name: businesses, properties, casino holdings. The paper trail almost always ran through associates, shell entities, and frontmen, structured specifically to insulate Lansky himself from the kind of documentary evidence prosecutors needed to make charges stick. One biographer, studying Lansky's operations in Florida, put it succinctly: you would search official records for Lansky's name attached to his own casino headquarters and find nothing, even though everyone in the business and everyone in law enforcement understood perfectly well who was actually running it. This is precisely the quality Coppola screenwriters were reaching for when they built Hyman Roth as a character who operates almost entirely through implication and misdirection rather than direct action. A man whose most dangerous qualities live in what he doesn't say, what he doesn't sign, what never quite gets traced back to him. It's also, not coincidentally, exactly the reputation that made federal investigators increasingly desperate across the 1950s and 60s to find any angle that might finally bring Lansky down. And it's what eventually led them, as it so often did with organized crime figures who couldn't be pinned on racketeering charges directly, to focus on taxes. By 1970, federal investigators believed they finally had Lansky on solid ground, a developing tax evasion case connected to money-skimming allegations tied to Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. The same hotel, strikingly, that had once belonged to his childhood friend Bugsy Siegel, and that Lansky's associates had taken control in the aftermath of Siegel's 1947 murder. Facing what he understood to be a serious, potentially life-ending prosecution, Lansky was already 68 years old, with the first serious signs of the heart trouble that would plague him for the rest of his life already beginning to appear. Lansky made a decision that would end up defining the final, strangest chapter of his entire public life. In July of 1970, Meyer Lansky and his second wife, Thelma, known to everyone in her life simply as Teddy, left their home in Miami Beach and flew to Israel, settling first in hotels and later in rented apartments in Herzliya Pichuak, a coastal town north of Tel Aviv. They brought with them, in one of the more oddly humanizing details of this entire story, their Shih Tzu, a dog named Brother, who Lansky would reportedly be seen walking along the streets of Tel Aviv and Herzliya with striking regularity over the following 2 years, an image almost impossible to reconcile with the popular imagination of what a hunted organized crime boss's life on a run should look like. Lansky's legal strategy hinged on one of the more distinctive and, at the time, still relatively untested provisions of Israeli law. The law of return, a foundational piece of Israeli legislation guaranteeing that any Jewish person, anywhere in the world, has a right to immigrate to Israel and, upon arrival, claim automatic citizenship. For a man facing serious federal prosecution back home, the law of return represented an almost irresistible legal lifeline. The possibility of becoming an Israeli citizen, and therefore, at least in theory, placing himself beyond the reach of American extradition efforts. It's worth pausing here on something genuinely important and genuinely surprising about Lansky's personal history, a dimension of his life that gets almost no attention in the Godfather Part II's fictionalized portrayal, but which apparently mattered enormously to Lansky himself, and which connects directly to that reported comment about wanting to be portrayed more sympathetically. By multiple biographical accounts, Lansky had, throughout his adult life, quietly maintained a genuine, active connection to Jewish causes and to the specific project of Israeli statehood. He was, according to several historical accounts, a real financial supporter of Jewish charitable organizations across the decades. During the 1940s, in the years leading up to Israel's establishment as a state in 1948, Lansky reportedly used his connections and resources to help arrange and finance weapons shipments to the Ghana, the underground Jewish paramilitary organization operating in British Mandatory Palestine that would go on to become the core of the newly formed Israeli Defense Forces. And in 1946, the very same year as the Havana Conference that anchors so much of this story, Lansky reportedly ordered members of his own organization to assist Holocaust survivors making their way toward Eretz Yisrael, contributing quietly to the broader, chaotic effort of Jewish immigration in the desperate years immediately following the Second World War. None of this, it's crucial to note, erases or excuses the decades of organized criminal activity that define the majority of Lansky's public life. But it complicates a flat, purely villainous portrait that a film like The Godfather Part II, constrained by runtime, by narrative focus, by the simple fact that Hyman Roth exists to serve Michael Corleone's story rather than his own, was ever going to have room to explore. The real Lansky arriving in Israel in 1970 wasn't simply a criminal exploiting a legal loophole with cynical calculation. He was, by his own reported understanding, and by the understanding of at least some of the Israeli officials who eventually had to rule on his case, a man with genuine, long-standing ties to the Jewish state. He was now asking to formally take him in. Israel, for its part, was not eager to grant that request. When Lansky's tourist visa expired and he formally applied for citizenship under the law of return, Israel's Interior Minister, Joseph Berg, rejected the application outright, citing the law's specific provision denying citizenship to individuals with criminal past considered likely to endanger the welfare of the state. Lansky, unwilling to simply accept the ruling, took the extraordinary step of appealing the decision all the way to Israel's Supreme Court, setting off a highly publicized, closely watched legal battle that would stretch on for nearly 2 years, with Lansky remaining in the country on an increasingly precarious tourist status, while the case worked its way through Israel's highest judicial body. The trial itself, which formally began in March of 1972, produced some genuinely remarkable courtroom exchanges. When Israeli Supreme Court Justice Chaim Cohen pressed government prosecutor Gabriel Bach on whether the state considered Lansky's alleged criminality to have actually been proven in any court of law, Bach reportedly responded that the government would be satisfied relying on even mere hearsay evidence to justify Lansky's exclusion. A striking admission of just how thin the government's actual legal case against Lansky was, resting more on decades of reputation, press coverage, and unproven accusation than on any formal criminal conviction anywhere in the world. Behind the scenes, the debate over Lansky's case became a genuine flashpoint in Israeli public and political life, touching on questions that extended well beyond one aging American gangster's personal legal fate. An unnamed senior Israeli official, speaking to journalists at the time, reportedly described Lansky as one of the most dangerous men in the world, insisting there was nothing arbitrary about the government's decision to keep him out. Whatever line you draw, the official reportedly said, Lansky would be on the other side of it. Lansky's own family pushed back forcefully against this characterization. His son, Paul Lansky, wrote a pointed letter to Interior Minister Berg directly challenging the government's position, asking, in a line that captures something genuinely sharp about the case's underlying hypocrisy, whether Israel hadn't, in fact, previously accepted financial assistance from people like his father, people about whom unfavorable comments had circulated for years. When the younger Lansky demanded, had the Israeli government ever declined such assistance before? It's a fair question, and one the Israeli government never really answered directly. But on September 11, 1972, Israel's Supreme Court ultimately ruled against Lansky, upholding Interior Minister Berg's original decision, and concluding that Berg had been justified in basing his ruling, at least in part, on the findings of a U.S. Congressional Committee's investigation into organized crime conducted back in 1950 and 1951. Testimony and findings that, notably, had never actually resulted in a criminal conviction against Lansky in any American court. With his final legal appeal exhausted, Meyer Lansky's time in Israel was over, And now we arrive back at the exact moment this entire investigation opened with. Except now, with the full weight of everything we've covered, you can understand exactly what was actually at stake as Meyer Lansky walked toward that departure gate. Interestingly, the United States government did not formally seek Lansky's extradition from Israel while the case was pending. A State Department spokesman explained at the time that the specific tax evasion and contempt charges against Lansky simply weren't covered as extraditable offenses under the existing 1962 Israel Extradition Treaty. In other words, for most of Lansky's 2 years in Israel, he wasn't technically fleeing American justice in any legally enforceable sense. He was simply, in the plainest terms, a man trying to find a permanent home in a country that ultimately decided it didn't want him. When Lansky's deportation was finalized, he flew back to the United States, landing at Miami International Airport in 1972. There was no cinematic ambush waiting for him. There was no rifleman positioned in a crowd. No dramatic slow-motion collapse on the airport tile in front of a bank of television cameras. What Lansky actually walked into was considerably more mundane, and in its own way, considerably more revealing about how the real machinery of American law enforcement actually operates compared to its Hollywood dramatization. FBI agents were waiting for him, and he was arrested on the spot, not on the underlying tax evasion charges directly, but on a related contempt of court charge, stemming from his prior failure to respond to a federal subpoena while he'd been in Israel. From here, the legal proceedings dragged on for roughly 2 more years, in a sequence of courtroom developments that read, frankly, like an extended demonstration of exactly how difficult it had always been to actually convict Meyer Lansky of anything. In February of 1973, a federal judge did convict him on that contempt of court charge, but Lansky appealed, and in December that same year, won a full reversal of conviction. In between, in March of 1973, Lansky underwent open-heart surgery, a serious procedure that, combined with his other documented health conditions, chronic bronchitis, ulcers, arthritis, bursitis, would go on to play a meaningful role in how the rest of his legal saga unfolded. The main event, the actual federal tax evasion trial connected to the original Flamingo skimming allegations, finally began in July of 1973, held in a federal district court in Miami. The prosecution's case rested substantially on the testimony of a cooperating witness, a mob associate nicknamed Fat Vinny Teresa, who swore under oath that he had personally delivered a cash payment to Lansky in Miami, connected to earnings from a London casino operation. Lansky's defense pushed back directly. His wife, Teddy, took the stand herself and testified that on the specific date in question, her husband had actually been recovering from a hernia operation at a hotel in Boston. And in one of those small, oddly specific human details that occasionally surface in a historical record and stick with you, that he had spent that time also nursing a sick family dog back to health. The jury believed the defense. Meyer Lansky was acquitted of all charges. Court-appointed physicians who had examined him over the course of the proceedings documented, for the official record, that he was genuinely suffering from serious heart trouble, chronic bronchitis, ulcers, bursitis, and arthritis. Findings that, whether or not they were legally decisive, certainly didn't hurt his case in the eyes of a jury being asked to imprison a visibly ailing 71-year-old man. And that was, in the most literal and legally final sense possible, the end of the United States government's decades-long effort to put Meyer Lansky behind bars for any meaningful length of time. He walked out of that Miami courtroom a free man, having survived nearly 50 years as one of the most closely watched organized crime figures in American history, with a grand total of 2 months of actual prison time to show for it. Compare that, for a moment, to what Hollywood needed from Hyman Roth. The film demanded closure, a definitive, morally weighted ending that could deliver some sense of consequence for everything Roth's character represented. The real story never gave anyone that kind of ending at all. It gave them a hung jury's worth of doubt, a series of legal technicalities, a chronically ill old man walking free, because the government's evidence, once again, simply wasn't strong enough to overcome nearly 50 years of Lansky's characteristic caution. There's one more detail worth including here, because it complicates the idea that Lansky's story with Israel ended cleanly and permanently in 1972. 8 years later, in 1980, Interior Minister Joseph Berg, the very same official who had originally ordered Lansky's expulsion, actually lifted the ban temporarily, permitting Lansky to return to Israel for a visit around the Jewish high holidays, reportedly after receiving evidence that the aging former gangster was now in genuinely poor health. Lansky, by then living quietly in Miami Beach, had expressed a personal desire to visit the country again before his health deteriorated further. According to the most detailed accounts of Lansky's later years, though, he ultimately never took Berg up on that offer. Despite multiple further requests and attempts in the years that followed, Meyer Lansky never set foot in Israel again after his 1972 deportation. Whether this reflected declining health, making international travel too difficult, lingering bitterness over how he'd been treated, or some combination of both, the historical record doesn't fully resolve, but adds one final layer of quiet, unresolved anticlimax to a chapter of his life already defined by exactly that quality. What did Meyer Lansky actually do with the final decade of his life after walking free from that Miami courtroom in 1973? By virtually every account, the answer is remarkably little that resembled the operatic criminal mastermind audiences had come to associate with his fictional counterpart on movie screens. He lived in a modest apartment in Miami Beach with Teddy. He was reportedly a familiar, unremarkable presence at a local hotel coffee shop, where he'd sit and feed pigeons, chat with other regulars, live out something close to an ordinary retiree's daily routine. A striking image for a man the FBI had once formally described as one of the most significant organized crime figures in the country. He continued walking dogs along the beach, the same small, quiet domestic ritual that had defined his time in Israel years earlier. The FBI, for its part, never entirely stopped watching him. Surveillance and investigation into Lansky's finances and associations continued right up through his final years, the government still hoping, apparently, to finally uncover the full scale of the fortune everyone assumed he'd hidden away somewhere beyond their reach. They never found it. And that mystery, what actually happened to Meyer Lansky's money, might be the strangest, most genuinely unresolved thread in this entire story. For decades, journalists, federal investigators, and organized crime historians alike operated on a shared assumption that Meyer Lansky, the single most financially sophisticated criminal figure of his generation, the man who had built an international laundering network spanning Havana, the Bahamas, London, and Switzerland, must have accumulated a personal fortune of genuinely staggering proportions. Estimates varied, but the figure most consistently cited echoed across newspaper coverage, FBI assessments, and later biographical accounts, put Lansky's net worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million. Given his estimated Cuban holdings alone before the revolution were valued around $20 million, and given the decades of gambling, laundering, and investment activity that followed his exit from Havana, a $300 million estate by the time of his death didn't strike anyone as an unreasonable guess. If anything, some assumed it was conservative. Meyer Lansky died of lung cancer on January 15, 1983, at his home in Miami Beach, at 80 years old. He was survived by his wife Teddy and his 3 children, and he was buried at Mount Nebo Cemetery in Miami. And then came one of the single strangest anticlimaxes in the entire history of American organized crime. Roughly 6 months after Lansky's death, according to a widely reported account, a longtime mob associate named Vincent Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo showed up at Lansky's apartment to collect on the last remaining piece of an outstanding debt Lansky had owed him. What he found, according to this account, was almost nothing. Some jewelry, a handful of other modest valuable possessions, a small collection of stocks and bonds, but nothing remotely resembling the vast, carefully concealed fortune that decades of federal investigation and popular speculation had assumed must exist somewhere. When Lansky's actual estate was formally assessed after his death, its documented value came in at approximately $57,000. $57,000. For a man whose life's work, by every popular account and FBI estimate, was believed to have generated a personal fortune in the hundreds of millions. So what actually happened to Meyer Lansky's money? This is genuinely one of organized crime history's enduring unsolved mysteries, and historians and biographers who study the question closely generally land on some combination of a handful of competing theories, none of which can be definitively proven. Perhaps the simplest explanation is also the most mundane. Perhaps the $300 million figure was always inflated from the start, a mixture of journalistic speculation FBI institutional embarrassment at never having successfully prosecuted him, and Lansky's own occasional, characteristically dry boasting, all combining over decades into a legend that ultimately outgrew whatever the real underlying numbers actually were. A second, more intriguing theory holds that Lansky's money was real, but that it was never truly his in any straightforward personal sense to begin with, that a significant portion of what passed through his hands over the decades ultimately belonged, in practice if not on paper, to the broader syndicate structure he'd helped build, meaning that whatever wealth existed may have already been distributed to other syndicate figures, laundered into corporate structures with ownership stakes, obscured well beyond what even a determined federal investigation could unwind, or simply absorbed back into the vast, decentralized financial network Lansky had spent his entire career deliberately designing to be untraceable. And a third theory, perhaps the most fitting given everything we now know about the man, holds that Lansky's fortune was simply laundered and hidden with such extraordinary, career-long thoroughness that it was never going to be found by his own family or by federal investigators, precisely because that had always been the entire point of the systems he'd spent 5 decades perfecting. If the true measure of Lansky's genius was his ability to make dirty money disappear so completely that it could never be traced back to him, then perhaps the ultimate, final proof of that genius is exactly this, that even in death, even with his family shocked to inherit almost nothing, his money simply vanished, precisely the way he had always intended it to. The honest, unglamorous truth is that nobody actually knows which of these explanations is correct, and it's entirely possible no one ever will. The FBI investigation that pursued Lansky for the better part of half a century never found the hidden fortune. His own family, by their own account, never found it either. And Meyer Lansky himself, characteristically, went his grave without ever explaining the discrepancy to anyone. So let's go back to where we started, that image of a small, aging man standing at an Israeli airport in 1972, waiting to board a flight back to a country that wanted to prosecute him, with absolutely no guarantee of what waited for him on the other side. The Godfather Part II couldn't resist the temptation to give that moment a dramatic, cinematic ending. Hyman Roth walks off his plane and into a wall of reporters and flashing cameras, and somewhere in that chaos, a hidden assassin ends his life in a single, decisive act of violence, a scene consciously modeled, as we mentioned at the start of this story, on the real, shocking 1963 murder of Lee Harvey Oswald, gunned down live on television in the basement of a Dallas police station. It's a stunning piece of filmmaking, and it gives Michael Corleone's arc exactly the kind of grim, morally weighted closure a 3-hour crime saga needs to land its final gut punch. The real Meyer Lansky got none of that. He got a customs line, an arrest on a contempt charge, 2 more years of appeals, a heart surgery, a courtroom in Miami, and eventually an acquittal. And then, astonishingly, almost anticlimactically, after everything he'd built and everything the U.S. government had spent decades trying to prove against him, he simply went home. He fed pigeons at a coffee shop. He walked his dog on Miami Beach. He lived for 11 more years, watched Hollywood turn his own life into an Academy Award-nominated performance, reportedly called up the actor who played him with a single, oddly touching note of feedback, and then died quietly of lung cancer in his own bed, leaving behind an estate worth less than the cost of a modest used car. There's a real, important lesson buried inside that gap between the myth and the man, and it's worth sitting with directly, because it says something true not just about Meyer Lansky specifically, but about how organized crime actually operated at the highest levels, as opposed to how popular culture has trained us to imagine it. The version of organized crime the Godfather saga dramatizes so unforgettably. The blood feuds, the dramatic assassinations, the operatic final confrontations between rival dons absolutely did happen at various points across this history. Bugsy Siegel really was murdered in a hail of gunfire through a living room window. Masuria and Maranzano really were killed to clear the way for a new generation of leadership. Violence was real, and it mattered enormously to how this world actually functioned. But the actual engine driving the specific empire Meyer Lansky built, the thing that made him, by most accounts, the single most successful and most enduring organized crime figure of the entire 20th century, was never really the violence at all. It was exactly the opposite. It was patience. It was financial sophistication. It was a discipline to keep his own name off the paperwork. to let other men take the risks and absorb the exposure while he quietly engineered the systems that moved and protected the money. It was a specific genius of building something durable enough to survive Prohibition's end, survive the deaths of virtually every close friend and partner from his earliest years, survive a 50-year federal investigation, and survive the complete collapse of his single greatest achievement, an entire Caribbean nation's gambling industry, seized overnight by a revolutionary government, without ever once losing his composure or, apparently, his freedom. That's a much harder story to tell in a movie theater. Audiences want a villain who gets what's coming to him, a clean moral ledger balanced by the final reel, the real history of organized crime in America, at least the story of the man who quietly built his financial architecture, refuses to offer that satisfaction. It offers instead something stranger and, in its own way, more unsettling. A man who broke essentially every law in the book for 50 consecutive years, who helped build an entire criminal industry that historians credibly compared to a major American corporation, and who nonetheless died in his own bed, surrounded by family, having spent his final decade doing almost nothing more dramatic than walking a small dog along a Florida beach. Hollywood killed Hyman Roth at that airport because the story demanded it. History let Meyer Lansky walk straight through it. And maybe that difference between the ending we want from our crime sagas and the genuinely uneventful, unresolved way organized crime's most sophisticated architect actually exited the stage tells us more about how power really operates in the shadows than any gunfight ever could. So here's the twist Hollywood never told you. The man who inspired one of cinema's most memorable villains didn't die in a blaze of gunfire. He died quietly, in his own bed, leaving behind a $57,000 estate that historians still can't reconcile with a rumored $300 million fortune. Where do you think it went? Swiss accounts that were never traced? Money that was never really his to begin with? Or was the whole legend always bigger than reality? Drop your theory in the comments. I read every single one. If this kept you hooked, do me a favor and hit subscribe, drop a like, and share with someone who loves The Godfather as much as you clearly do. And if you want the story that started all of this, the real Bugsy Siegel, the flamingo, and the murder that's still officially unsolved 50 years later, that video's coming next. You're not going to want to miss it.